Veteran rockers. It's more than just music. It's more than just a couple of chords. It's something that speaks to your heart, speaks to your mind, speaks to your inner soul. It's something that gets you through a bad day. Think of the songs that have gotten you through rough breakups. It's an experience. And let's go deeper.
Here's your host, Mike Fox.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Veteran Rockers. I'm your host, Mike Fox. Now, if you were listening on Mixcloud, you just heard David Bowie in the lower third, Can't Help Thinking About Me. If you're watching on YouTube, take a look right behind me. You see that vinyl there in the background? I'll give you a better view. David Bowie. The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. This episode's focusing on Bowie's life, Bowie's career before that. Even before Space Oddity. Even before The Man Who Sold the World. Because the 60s was when Bowie was just getting started in the London scene. And he was in several different bands and had a different name. His name was not David Bowie yet. But if you were listening on Mixcloud, the song that was just played was a song called Can't Help Thinking About Me, which I'll talk about momentarily. It was with a band called The Lower Third. So let's go back to the beginning of Bowie's life. David Robert Jones was born in 1947 in Brixton, and at the age of only 13, he was so inspired by the jazz scene in London's West Village, which led David to picking up his first saxophone. Now, Bowie's early years were far from a conventional type of life. In 1996, he actually told BBC, begin quote, "It wasn't a particularly happy childhood. My parents were cold emotionally, and there weren't many hugs. I always craved affection because of that." End quote. Now, Bowie always did seem like a very sensitive man, and I think it came across in his music, in his songwriting style. Sometimes certain songs you did just feel like somebody's reaching out to you and communicating to you. He had that unique ability, even if it was in the realm of fiction. You knew he was taking something real from his life and putting it into the music. Now, despite a 10-year age difference, Bowie was very close to his half-brother, Terry Burns, who had proved to be a big part, a big influence in his life. He was always trying to protect him from the schizophrenia that was on his mom's side of the family. But the half-brothers did part ways for a couple years when in 1956 Terry was called to be in the national service. A year later, the Jones family had departed Brixton for Bromley, an outer borough of Greater London, where he met his lifelong friend, Jeff McCormack, who would later work with Bowie as a backing singer, as well as George Underwood. Now, Bowie had joined the Bromley Technical High School in 1958. There were many influences that hit him. After being demobbed, his half-brother Terry went back and introduced him to Beat Poets and Jack Kerouac's book, On the Road. As I said before, Bowie had picked up a saxophone, so he was showing him some of the jazzier and R&B spots of that part of London, of the central London neighborhood, and they were a bit sleazier. So Bowie had a sax, and he took a greater interest in the art with some experimentation. Of course, that's when Owen Frampton comes into the picture, Peter's dad. Probably the biggest change that came about Bowie's early life happened in 1962. When him and George Underwood had a falling out, it was over a girl named Carol. Underwood recalled this. "I was so aggrieved. And then I just walked up to him, turned him around, and went whack without even thinking." The thing is, his punch left Bowie's left eye with some serious consequences. He needed 3 different operations to save his sight. Bowie had been left with a permanently dilated pupil that gave him the appearance of having different colored eyes. Yeah, Bowie once said, when reflecting on those early years, he said, begin quote, "I've always been a very curious and enthusiastic person. I had a very short attention span and would move from one thing to another quite rapidly. Now, thus explains how he had been moving from different bands throughout that decade. The next band that he joined was an R&B flavored Davy Jones and the King Bees, which he formed with George Underwood, and they released their 1964 solo release, Liza Jane. Now, that tune sank without a trace, but it got Bowie noticed. His name was still Jones. He was not David Bowie yet. So the next band he joined was called the Manish Boys. Their pair hatched the kind of publicity stunt that would really propel Bowie during the 70s. His dad had some PR connections. The London Evening News did a story about the Manish Boys, and they all had long hair, so this was kind of like angry fathers with these crew cuts were probably like, look at these kids with girly hairs, but they were basically talking about how they were being mistreated because of their long hair. So Bowie had claimed to be the leader of the Society for the Preservation of Cruelty to Long-Haired Men. His hair was so long it was resting on his eyebrows and collar. Bowie said, "We're all fairly tolerant, but for the last 2 years we've had comments like darling and can I carry your handbag thrown at us, and I think it just has to stop now." Now, this didn't work as far as getting them noticed musically, but it did get them some TV press, and people did know who he was at that point. So this comes to 1965, the song that I opened with on the Mixcloud version of this episode, Can't Help Thinking About Me. This was when he had changed his name to David Bowie, but originally the band was called Davy Jones and the Lower Third. He just wanted to avoid any confusion because of the emerging star Davy Jones of the Monkees. So the single flopped in 66, but it made a change in Bowie's songwriting, sort of revealing this narcissistic, self-aware type of glee. He was on the face of the London scene. So he joined another band called The Buzz, and he was performing at the Marquee regularly. Bowie had then been introduced to his manager, Ken Pitt, who would manage him in this next part of Bowie's career. So that was for about 3.5 years after this. So they worked together, but it was still hard to free him from obscurity. Pitt worked with a UK publicist who also worked for Judy Garland, Frank Sinatra, and Jerry Lee Lewis. He encouraged David to kind of develop this sort of cabaret type of act. But Bowie wanted a more singer-songwriter route, inspired by Velvet Underground's debut album that had given him a new manager. Another big influence Bowie had was a man by the name of Anthony Newley. Now, Pitt admitted in a 1985 BBC interview, begin quote, "It was very difficult to get him noticed at that time," end quote. Now, he encouraged Bowie to turn to acting. Now, he did get a role of painting brought to life in a short film, The Image. Bowie then teamed up with buzz guitarist John Hutchinson to form a group called The Feathers, but their blend of folk, poetry, and mime didn't have a very strong appeal. So people weren't sure what he was. Was he a mime or a hippie? So London didn't know what to make of him. So there was always something about him that didn't quite fit. So all these events, all these efforts, you thought he would give up by this point. But it was after performing with the Feathers at the Roundhouse in London in September of '68, Bowie met his future wife and champion Angie Barnett. Calvin Lee was also at that show, sharing her enthusiasm, helping Bowie get signed to Mercury Records in 1970. Later on, of course, because this was '68. Bowie's breakthrough single, Space Oddity, would change things forever. Bowie's inspiration to that song was he was inspired by Stanley Kubrick's sci-fi classic 2001: A Space Odyssey. He said, begin quote, "I was very stoned, and when I went to see it several times, and it was really a revelation to me," end quote. Bowie admitted that. He said it got the song flowing. So it was released in July of '69 to coincide with the first ever NASA moon landing. So it did peak number 5 in the UK singles charts. But this was actually his second album. The first album he had released was a self-titled album called David Bowie. Very folksy. And you listen to a couple tracks, I'll be honest with you, nothing really grabbed me. But these tracks that I played from these other bands that he was working with, like the Lower Third, Manish Boys, I really feel that these songs were sort of what showed a little bit of a different side of David Bowie. Because even though the music may have been like straightforward for that era of the 1960s. Then again, what was really straightforward for that era in the 1960s? But it was definitely fashionable. Definitely fashionable. Definitely catchy. But that being said, it was still David Bowie. But he was trying to find himself. And he finally did in the late 1960s. My favorite album of him, though, is right here. Every track on this album is absolutely stacked with so much imagination, so meticulously written. This is like one of the first ever true concept albums. This came out before Dark Side of the Moon, a year before it, 1972. And Bowie does play sax on this album. That was the first instrument that he ever learned. So I hope you enjoyed learning about the early years of David Bowie. Thanks for listening to this episode of Veteran Rockers. Please like, rate, review, and share this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to Veteran Rockers on your preferred podcasting app and subscribe to my Veteran Rockers channel on Mixcloud, where you can not only hear my radio show called Veteran Rockers Radio, but you can also hear this same episode that you just listened to with music. And follow Veteran Rockers on all major social media platforms, Facebook, X, and Instagram. Keep rock alive, because after all, it's a wild world and rock and roll never dies.